Continuing from our discussion on Hayek's core values, it's clear that his views on how society and even our minds evolve are often where the real fireworks happen. Many scholars have come out swinging, calling his ideas dogmatic or crude. But let's try a different angle today. We're going to unpack his thoughts on social evolution and the mind, showing how they're not just separate topics, but deeply intertwined parts of his larger intellectual project. The key is seeing how his evolutionary insights fit into his broader analysis of complex systems, rules, and spontaneous order, something many miss. So, right at the heart of Hayek's approach to understanding complex things like societies are these twin ideas: evolution and spontaneous order. Now, some folks might look at these two and say, evolution, spontaneous order, aren't those just buzzwords thrown together? But Hayek wasn't playing games. He consistently linked them, suggesting that if you want to grasp how complex systems work, especially social ones, you need both evolutionary thinking and the concept of spontaneous order. Think of it as his go-to toolkit for tackling the really messy, intricate problems of human interaction. To truly get Hayek, we absolutely have to make sense of this twin ideas thesis. Okay, so what makes something complex according to Hayek? He lays out 7 key features, most of which are pretty standard in modern complexity theory. First, complex phenomena involve lots of variables. Hayek even defines complexity partly by the sheer number of variables, though later thinkers might argue it's more about how those variables interact. Second, and this is crucial, organized complexity arises not just from the individual parts, but from how they're connected. This leads to emergent properties. New patterns pop up because of the interactions, not just the sum of the individual elements. Think liquidity in water. You can't predict ripples from knowing about a single molecule. Third, these systems can be tightly coupled. A small nudge here can cause massive shifts elsewhere. Fourth, they tend to be self-maintaining, persisting, and adapting. Fifth, they're rarely in equilibrium. Theories might show a tendency towards it, like price theory showing prices move towards equilibrium, but predicting the exact price is another story. Sixth, they're constantly novel, always changing, always discovering new things. And finally, because of all this complexity, there's no single global controller who knows everything needed to manage the whole system effectively. That last point, by the way, hits right at the heart of his critique of central planning. Now, given these characteristics of complex systems, what does this mean for science trying to study them? Hayek argues quite bluntly, forget predicting the specific future state of every single part. In physics, we can often nail down predictions with precision. But in complex systems like an economy, we simply can't. It's like trying to solve nonlinear equations. There isn't just one answer. So, what can we do? We can predict the range of phenomena we should expect and understand the general principles governing the system. We can figure out the boundaries within which the system will likely operate. This distinction is huge. It's why Hayek warns against using scientific models to engineer society. If we can't predict the specifics, trying to centrally control the outcome is doomed to fail. It's about understanding the rules of the game, not predicting every throw of the dice. Let's zoom in on Hayek's application of this to society. He makes a critical distinction between the specific rules people follow, like don't steal or keep your promises, and the emergent social order of actions that results when many people follow such rules. His insight is profound. The same overall pattern of cooperation could arise from wildly different sets of individual rules. Imagine 2 villages with completely different customs, yet both manage to cooperate effectively for irrigation. Conversely, the same set of rules might lead to very different outcomes depending on the environment. What really matters for a group's survival, Hayek insists, is this emergent order of actions, not just whether individuals follow rules. It's easy to misunderstand this. Someone might say, aha, the group is just a mirror image of its rules. But Hayek says no. The order is more than just the reflection. It's an emergent property shaped by the interplay of rules and context. This focus on the pattern, not just the parts, is fundamental. So we have this idea of spontaneous order explaining how a complex social order emerges and maintains itself. Think of economics explaining how markets coordinate exchange. But Hayek points out that's still mostly a static picture. It tells us how the system works now, but not how it got that way or how it changes over time. Real-world systems are shaped by history, by the specific environments they've encountered. This is where evolutionary accounts come in. Hayek saw evolutionary thinking as providing in-principle explanations for how these complex orders change and develop. It's like Darwinian evolution in biology. It explains the principles guiding species development, showing what's possible and impossible, without predicting the exact future of any particular organism or species. Hayek's genius was applying this evolutionary logic to the intricate dance of social cooperation. Let's boil down Hayek's core idea of social evolution. What are we trying to explain? The explanandum is the rise and development of this emergent social order of actions. The Great Society, as he sometimes called it, the overall pattern of coordinated action. And how do we explain it? The explanans is an evolutionary process. Think of it like this. The rules and institutions that form the social order are selected through competition. Not just between individuals, but between different social orders, different ways of organizing cooperation. Which order prevails depends on how well its constituent rules and institutions perform in the real world, in the specific environment it faces. There's a rough analogy here to biological evolution. Think of rules like genes and the social order like an organism. Just as genetic variation gives organisms advantages, variations in rules give social orders advantages in the competitive landscape. Now, a common confusion arises here. People hear Hayek talk about practices being maintained because they help the group survive, and they think, oh, that sounds like functionalism. In biology, functionalism explains a trait like a heart by its function pumping blood. So, does Hayek mean rules exist because they serve a function for the group? Hayek would say, no, that gets it backwards. Evolutionary explanations like Darwin's are causal explanations of development. They tell a story about history, about competitive pressures that selected certain traits. The function of a heart is a consequence of that evolutionary history, not the reason it exists. Similarly, for Hayek, once we understand the evolutionary story of how a social order developed, we can then observe that the rules within it often serve functions that contributed to its success. But the existence of those rules is explained by the evolutionary process, not by their current utility. It's the history that explains the present structure, not the present function explaining the past selection. Alright, so how does this selection actually happen? Hayek emphasizes competition for survival, but crucially, it's the competition between social orders of actions, not individuals. This is key to why he's not a social Darwinist in the crude sense. He stresses that the rules themselves are the carriers of advantageous traits. However, he sometimes uses the term groups, which can be a bit slippery. Does this imply individuals should sacrifice for the group's survival? That opens up classic collective action problems, the prisoner's dilemma, where acting for the group's good might not be rational for the individual. Hayek pushes back. His focus is on the order of actions, the system of cooperation enabled by rules. These rules actively regulate behavior. Furthermore, he has a fascinating idea. Our very conception of reason is shaped by the social order we live in. Successful social orders, he suggests, evolve ways of thinking, ways of reasoning, that encourage people to follow the rules that keep the order functioning. It's not just about survival instinct, it's about culturally embedded notions of rationality. Another potential mechanism Hayek highlights is comparative growth in wealth and population. The idea is simple. Groups with better rules, better customs, tend to become wealthier and grow faster. They can expand, fend off threats, and perhaps more importantly, attract people from other groups. Think about historical examples. Often, more prosperous, well-coordinated societies did seem to absorb or influence less successful ones. Now, some critics point fingers, saying, look at Western countries with low birth rates, or China's massive population despite authoritarianism. Hayek would counter that evolutionary selection isn't about isolated snapshots. It's about long-term trends and overall fitness. A society might experience a temporary boom or face unique demographic shifts. The question is whether, over the long haul, certain types of cooperative orders are simply better at sustaining larger populations and generating prosperity, giving them a cumulative advantage. The collapse of command economies, which clearly struggled to produce enough wealth, certainly lends some weight to this idea. Hayek also points to an endogenous mechanism, something happening within the social order itself. Remember our gene-organism analogy? Here it's like there are pressures on the genes from two sides. Similarly, rules face selection pressure from two directions. First, there's the big picture. Do the rules help the entire social order compete successfully against other orders? Second, there's the internal dynamic. Do the rules gain acceptance and support from the individuals living within that society? Individuals might break rules if they feel it benefits them locally, even if it hurts the group in the long run. This internal friction, this tension between individual incentives and group norms, is actually what drives gradual evolution and improvement. Hayek even suggests that new rules, the mutations in this cultural evolution, might arise more readily when existing rules aren't working well for people. When things are tough, people experiment, break old molds. This makes the idea of selection based on growth or prosperity more plausible, as declining societies might see increased rule breaking and experimentation. Okay, we have selection mechanisms. But for evolution to work, you also need a replicator, something that copies itself accurately enough. In biology, it's the gene. Hayek sees rules as the replicators in social evolution. How do they copy? Through imitation, through cultural transmission, like norms spreading during colonization. But here's the rub: imitating behavior, copying the output, is notoriously unreliable. Think of a game of telephone. The message gets distorted. If each generation just copies the previous one's actions, without understanding the underlying rule, the rule could drift into something completely different over time. For evolution to function properly, the replication needs to be reasonably faithful. Hayek's challenge, however, seems significant. He insists that many of the rules guiding us are unconscious, habits, propensities to act, things we don't explicitly know or articulate. If rules are largely unconscious, how can they be copied accurately across generations without the aid of explicit language or instruction? This fidelity problem is a major hurdle for his account. To tackle this fidelity problem, Hayek turns to his fascinating theory of the mind. He was actually an early pioneer in neural network modeling, building on associationist psychology. Think of it like this: our minds are like vast networks of interconnected nodes, neurons. Thoughts aren't little homunculi in the head. Instead, they emerge from patterns of activation across these connections. When something happens, it triggers a pattern of activation. Similar events trigger similar patterns, leading us to perceive them as the same. Learning happens when the strengths of these connections' weights change based on experience. Past experiences aren't stored directly, they're encoded indirectly in the altered structure of the network. Hayek's contribution was applying this connectionist idea to understand perception, learning, and ultimately, how rules are acquired and followed. So, how does this neural network view help with rules and replication? First, Hayek sees the mind fundamentally as a classification engine. The central nervous system takes the raw, undifferentiated input from the world and channels it through the network, creating a structured experience. Two events are perceived as the same if they trigger the same neural configuration. This means the mind operates like a set of rules, mapping inputs to perceptions. Crucially, Hayek doesn't equate mind with consciousness. Much of this rule following, this processing, happens unconsciously. Consciousness itself, he suggests, operates on similar connectionist principles. And this extends to action. Just as perception is rule-governed, so too is action. Practical rules connect patterns of sensory input to patterns of motor output. Following a rule means having a disposition to act in a certain way when triggered. This neatly connects back to his idea of unconscious rule following. Second, learning in this model is about shaping the network. The mind learns about the world by having its neural connections reinforced or weakened by the environment. Our mental map of the world is forged by experience. This directly supports Hayek's famous claim that reason is shaped by culture. Our capacity for reason, our neural architecture, is formed in the specific social and cultural context we inhabit. This explains how cultural evolution influences our very capacity for thought. And this offers a potential solution to the fidelity problem. Rules aren't just copied behaviorally, they're encoded into the structure of the neural network. Because we share similar environments, our brains develop similar maps, similar sets of connections, ensuring high-fidelity transmission of rules, even unconscious ones. Cultural selection, therefore, creates reason. The evolution of society drives the evolution of the mind. The brain is essentially an organ designed to absorb and navigate the cultural environment. Third, this neural network view is inherently decentralized. Intelligence isn't controlled by a central boss in the brain, it emerges from the complex interactions across the entire network. This resonates perfectly with Hayek's argument that the rules of society collectively possess more intelligence than any single person's thoughts. Both the societal order and the individual mind are decentralized systems. Fourth, the mind itself is another complex phenomenon. We can understand its principles, but full comprehension, especially self-comprehension, is limited. Hayek argues forcefully that the mind cannot fully explain itself. Any model of X requires processes outside of. To model our own minds, we'd need mental processes outside our minds, which is impossible. Plus, because mental states depend on the whole network, we can't even adequately model just a part of the mind. It's a logical dead end, he concludes. The idea of the mind explaining itself is nonsense. So wrapping up, Hayek's work on social evolution and the mind is far more sophisticated than often portrayed. It's a tightly integrated system dealing with complexity, the limits of prediction, evolutionary processes, and the nature of the mind. This helps us see past some common criticisms. Is he contradictory? No. Knowing the principles why central planning fails doesn't mean we can predict the optimal outcome of complex processes. Is he a rigid traditionalist? Not necessarily. While he respects evolved norms, his theory allows for change driven by individuals responding to local conditions, though he's deeply skeptical of top-down attempts to reshape society. And does it lack normative grounding? Hayek argues that because cultural evolution shapes our very understanding of reason and morality, the norms that survive evolution do have a legitimate claim to our attention. Ultimately, Hayek offers a compelling, if challenging, perspective, one that acknowledges the profound limits of our knowledge about complex social systems, yet provides powerful arguments for liberty and caution against the hubris of central control.